Okay, welcome folks to another video on Kant's ethical theory. This is in a series of 3 videos. This is the second part of those 3 videos. Whereas last time we learned about Kant's theory of the categorical imperative. This is a commandment of reason to act in a certain way. But it's different from a commandment of reason that says something like, if you want to stay healthy, you should eat good food and exercise. The idea with those kinds of imperatives, which are called hypothetical imperatives, is that if you stopped caring about being healthy, you wouldn't have a reason to exercise anymore. But Kant thinks that we have some ethical duties of reason, which apply to us even when our desires are not in favor of doing the thing. So Kant says that a categorical imperative is a commandment of reason to act in a certain way, but in a way that doesn't depend on your desires or the rationality of getting what you care about. So as we go on with Kant, we're going to learn that there are different ways of getting at the idea that there are rules of reason for you to act that apply to you no matter what. So we're going to look at the first 2 formulations of Kant's categorical imperative. And we're going to start with this really interesting and important first formulation. And this first formulation of the categorical imperative is called the principle of universalizability. Now, here's the official wording from our text by Russ Schaefer-Landau. An action is morally acceptable if, and only if, its maxim is universalizable. When we see this phrase, if and only if, that means in any case and in every case. Or we can say that all morally acceptable actions are going to be universalizable, and all universalizable actions are going to be morally acceptable. It's like a one-to-one correspondence between this concept of being morally right and the other concept of being universalizable, or having a universalizable maxim. So we're going to dive deeper into what that means in just a second. But we should also clarify something, because you might have read this and said, oh, a universalizable moral principle, maybe it's like the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Y'all have heard this principle, and in fact, it's not just a Christian principle, but you can see it in Buddhism and Judaism and Sikhism and pretty much every religion, and maybe many non-religious ethical codes throughout history. This rule that says, think about how you want others to treat you, you should treat them like that. But the categorical imperative, and specifically the principle of universalizability, is not the same thing as the golden rule. Remember that we said that the categorical imperative is necessary, like it has to be true no matter what, and especially no matter what your desires happen to be. But notice that when we look at the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, it's making direct reference to the question of how would you like to be treated, right? And in this way, we might think that there's actually something a little weird or misguided about the golden rule, and Kant, in fact, picks up on this very problem. He points out that if you have certain desires, then that would change what your moral duties are. And in that way, it would actually turn morality into a series of hypothetical imperatives. So the way that Kant puts it, he says, imagine somebody is a masochist. Just to remind everyone listening, when we're talking about a masochist, we're talking about somebody who likes to be hurt or belittled in some way. There are people who are like this. You may know a few. But think about the fact that if you are a masochist and you want others to hurt and belittle you, well, according to the literal word of the golden rule, that would give you the right to hurt and belittle others. But we should notice that just because you're a masochist doesn't make it suddenly okay to hurt and belittle others. So in that way, if we read the letter of the law in the Golden Rule, it cannot capture this point. But once we recognize that hurting and belittling others is morally wrong, the categorical imperative will say, well, yeah, that's because these are categorical imperatives that they apply to us no matter what. So let's zoom back. If we're not thinking treat others how you would like to be treated, we have to think about another way of thinking about what it means for an action to be acceptable when it has a universalizable maxim. So let's look closer at that. Instead of treating others how you would like to be treated, Kant wants to think about morality fundamentally in terms of fairness and consistency. That is, you are just one individual among others, and the rules that apply to you apply to everyone else, but the rules that apply to everyone else also apply to you. So just to get the wording of that principle on the board again, an action is morally acceptable if and only if the maxim is universalizable. Now, you might have said, okay, what's going on with this word maxim? I don't know that word. Now, you could go to the dictionary, but in this case, it's better to just listen to your textbook and understand what Kant means by the word here and now in this context. And Kant is really interested in this idea that every intentional action that people undertake is an intentional action that has a plan behind it. Or we might say that there's a principle behind everything that you do on purpose. So we can think about it as when you act in certain ways, you are committing yourself to certain principles. And to get a little bit more specific and a little more technical, we can say that every time you act in a certain way and have a maxim behind your intentional actions, it's going to state both a plan of action. So if this happens, I'm going to do the other thing, right? And the other thing that a maxim has built into it is an aim or a goal, right? So we might say, for instance, that by waking up on time, that allows you to get to work when you need to be on time, right? So we would say that, like, look, that could have both what you're going to do, set my alarm for 7 a.m. And why? Well, because I need to be at my desk for 8 a.m. sharp or 9 a.m. sharp or whenever you're set up to get to work, right? So the idea is when we think about people's actions, we're going to say that there's a principle behind them, and a maxim is a combination of a plan of action and an aim, right? So now we can start to ask the question, well, what kinds of aims, what kinds of principles for living are good ones? Well, Kant is going to say it's the universalizable one. And here's another thought. We have to have an aim that accepts the fact that you are one person among many. So if morality is really based on reason, as Kant tells us, well, reason for me is the same as reason for you. Like, it's not like we all get our own different version of logic. Well, Kant's going to say, in a similar way, and actually for the very same reason, we don't get our own specific version of morality. The moral rules are the same for everybody. So, this is the key, this is the kicker, and this is the idea that we're going to follow through and really try to understand for the rest of the video. Acting immorally, for Kant, is all about making yourself an exception to the rules. And in this way, morally wrong behavior is fundamentally unfair. So I'll say that one more time because it's super important. Make sure you really think through what the consequences of this are. Acting immorally, doing the wrong, the bad thing, acting against duty, is making yourself an exception to the rules. And when you are acting immorally, you're always doing something unfair. So let's try to think of some examples where we think of immorality that can be characterized particularly as making yourself an exception to the rules. Well, here's one example. Can you imagine, and maybe you've seen this person out in the wild, the person who cuts in line at the coffee shop to save time. You could imagine them trying to jerk their way in on the drive-through line, or it might be somebody who simply steps ahead of you in line and yells out their order to the barista at the coffee shop. Oftentimes when you meet this kind of, I'll just say the word jerk, when you meet this kind of jerk, they'll probably give you some story and say, do you know who I am? When you confront them about what they're doing. And that is a fundamentally unfair way of moving through the world. Right? Now, to break it down, we can take this method that Kant gives us. Can we have a maxim and can everybody live by it? Or is this a rule where you're making an exception of yourself? Well, here's a maxim. I will cut in line at the coffee shop in order to save time. That's what that jerk is doing, right? Now, here's the next move, and we'll get even clearer on this as we move forward. We have to ask the question, is this maxim a universalizable maxim? Which is to say, is this a maxim that everybody could live by? Well, here's how we want to interpret this case. If we want to think like a Kantian, if everybody cut in line, there wouldn't be a line anymore. There would just be a mob, right? So it goes from having a line to cut to having no line to cut at all, and now you can't even act on this maxim, cut line at coffee shop. To take another similar example, imagine you're out on I-40 and it's standstill traffic jam. Maybe it's this same jerk. This time they're blasting their sports car through the emergency lane in order to save time. Well, here's Kant's question about what's so unfair about that. What if everybody blasted their car through the emergency lane in order to save time? Well, if we all tried to do that, we'd just go from a 2-lane traffic jam to a 3-lane traffic jam. So in this way, that principle is not one that we could all live by. So the idea of acting on a non-universalizable maxim is you are depending on others to live by one set of rules and then making yourself an exception to that very same set of rules. A really important thing to notice about Kant's principle of universalizability is that this is not a utilitarian analysis. Unfortunately, I see this mistake plenty when people think that they're appealing to Kant in an ethical argument. They'll say something like this: if everyone did that, things would be terrible. So you can't do blah, blah, blah. Now, if you make that kind of argument, this is sometimes an ethically compelling argument. But if you make that kind of argument about things being terrible, then you're actually appealing to rule consequentialism, right? Kant is not appealing or focusing on a question of the consequences of adopting a rule. It's actually more so about being consistent and this key question about whether the rules you live by are making yourself an exception to the rules you expect others to live by. Just to take one example, we might think about the fact that some people live a celibate life, right? Especially somebody who goes into the priesthood in Catholicism, right? The thought is this person might adopt a maxim that says, I will live a life of celibacy in order to devote my life to the contemplation of God. Now, the funny thing is that you are not making yourself an exception to any rules, because it's actually possible for everybody to devote themselves to a life of celibacy in order to contemplate God. It's not like we'd turn a 2-lane traffic jam into a 3-lane traffic jam. In fact, it would just be the type of world where everybody's celibate and everybody's contemplating God. That would, in fact, be a universalizable principle in Kant's terms. Even if rule consequentialism might say, well, that would actually be a bad rule for everybody to adopt, because then we wouldn't get another generation of human beings. Right? So, just to repeat that, it might be worth your while to give a utilitarian analysis to the question of what if everybody did that? But please notice that that is not Kant's question. Kant's question is more a question about fairness and consistency. So we've already seen a couple of examples of applying this principle of universalizability on our maxims. Let's get even more specific on how to test any action according to the principle of universalizability. So the stuff that's not in bold is from your textbook again. The stuff in bold is my distillation. So these are the questions you need to ask if you want to run a Kantian analysis of universalizability on your actions. So the first thing you're going to do is formulate your maxim. Remember, that's what you're going to do and why, or your plan and your aim. Right? So what's your plan of action? What do you want to achieve? What's my plan? What's my aim? Second question, we try to think about a world where everybody lives by that same principle of action, by that same maxim. So imagine my plan is adopted by everyone. So now it's not the kind of thing that's an exception to the rules. We're trying to imagine, what if everybody engaged in the same principle of action? And then we would ask, is it possible for my goal to be achieved in a world where everybody else is living by the same principle? So we actually saw, if blowing through the emergency lane to avoid a traffic jam is adopted by all, well, then you can't achieve your aim anymore. We've just converted a 2-lane traffic jam to a 3-lane traffic jam. Right? So the thought here is going to be, this is the kind of test you can run on any action. So let's consider a specific set of cases. And for Kant, these are going to be 2 cases where we have a wrong action and a right action, and we'll see how the Kantian test of universalizability applies. So here's our first question. What's my plan and what's my aim? So in the first case, we might say, look, if we're trying to identify the maxim, we might say, I'm going to say a thing that I don't believe to be true. And what am I trying to do here? Well, we might say I'm trying to spare my friend some feelings, right? So your friend might be asking a question about their ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, or they might be asking whether their new hat looks good, right? And you might think to yourself, well, they're not going to like what I actually believe, so I'm just going to tell them something else so that they don't get sad. But then we imagine a world where everybody says untrue things in relevantly similar contexts. We're going to say, what if everybody adopted this principle? Say the untrue thing to avoid possible discomfort. Now, here's Kant's analysis, and I invite you to question and examine whether he's made the right analysis here. But he's going to say, if you adopt any plan of action and universalize it when it involves lying, right? So if everybody lied to avoid discomfort, nobody would trust anybody anymore. So his thought is, your words won't mean anything if there is a universal principle of lying. And if that's the case, we could no longer convince our friend that there's nothing wrong or there's nothing to worry about by uttering some words. The friend might be thinking, look, this person isn't actually trying to communicate the truth to me. They're just trying to do what is convenient. So in this way, you can't achieve your aim when everybody adopts the same principle. So we're going to say lying is not universalizable, and in this sense, you're making yourself an exception to the rules, so it's morally wrong. Now, here's another example. You might think of somebody who says, I want to exercise to stay healthy. Well, again, we can cash that out in terms of a maxim, right? So the plan, do weights and cardio, maybe 1 or 2 days of weights and 1 or 2 days of cardio every week. And you might think about why do you want to do this? And I think a good answer for why we exercise is, well, because it feels good to exercise for some people. And it's also going to help our bodies do things that we like doing with our bodies. We might say this is a good reason to exercise. Now we can then say, imagine my plan is adopted by everyone. Well, that means that imagine a world in which everybody adopts a plan that says, I'm going to do weights and cardio, maybe 2 days of weights and 2 days of cardio every week. And everybody has this goal. Well, it's because I want to feel good and retain mobility. Now, one suggestion we might make here is oh my gosh, the gym is going to be completely full. I'm not going to be able to get a treadmill at Planet Fitness anymore. That's more of a practical question, and that's not necessarily what Kant is asking for the last thing. For one thing, we could always build more gyms. For another thing, there are a lot of ways to do weights and cardio without requiring any new equipment. So I could do weights and cardio in my house by doing jumping jacks and push-ups. And we could imagine, I could still achieve that goal, even if everybody else adopted a plan to exercise as well. So this is a case where your ultimate aim is achievable, even when everybody else is acting by the same rules. So therefore, exercising for health is universalizable, so it's morally okay. Now, notice that I didn't say it's morally required. There are, in fact, many actions that are morally permissible, but they're not morally required. That means it's okay for you to do it, but you don't have to do it. Because we might realize that, don't bother doing weights or cardio in order to relax. Well, it turns out that everybody could avoid exercise and relax. So, in this way, Kant is going to tell us that for a lot of parts of life, morality will say, well, both choices are fair. That is, they don't make yourself an exception to the rules. And therefore, both are okay. All right, so now we've got the general gist of Kant's theory of universalizability on the table. It's all about fairness, not making yourself an exception to the rules, and we've learned how to run this universalizability test on any action. Find your maxim, imagine everybody adopting the maxim, and think about whether it's still possible to achieve your aim. Now, we should end by thinking critically about that theory, and part of that is considering the best possible objections we can come up with. So here's one objection, and it says, look, just because you're being consistent doesn't necessarily mean you're acting rightly. So the objection we get in our textbook, Schaefer-Landau, says that fanatics' actions seem universalizable in some situations. So the fanatic, as Schaefer-Landau calls them, is somebody who is principled, but this person also has frightening and revolting values. So what we're trying to think of here is a person who is at least apparently consistent, but who then again is also revolting in their values. So the example that Schaefer-Landau gives, and a saddening example and a frightening example indeed, is a Nazi. But let's think about this as a logically consistent Nazi. And let's say that this Nazi is so committed to the extermination of what they believe to be inferior races, that this Nazi would commit suicide if they themselves learned that they had Jewish ancestry. Right? So the thought is, we could imagine the fanatic's aim of, say, pursuing racial purity. It could be fulfilled if everybody in the world adopted that fanatic's maxim. Right? But, and this should be obvious to anybody with a mind and a heart, we might think, look, just because there can be rationally consistent Nazis, that suggests that the universalizability test fails to give us an adequate test for the morality of actions. So that's the first objection, that consistency isn't all we need for morality, and consistency isn't a guarantee that you've done the right thing. Because we can at least imagine a consistent Nazi, but that doesn't make them any more morally admirable than we think they are, which is not morally admirable at all. Here's a second objection. This objection is not in your book, but from a logical point of view, we might think it's the next thing that we might consider. Because this says that universalizability is not sufficient. That is, it's not enough to be sure that we've got a right action. We might also ask the question of whether universalizability is a necessary condition for action. So one problem for the theory is a universalizable action that is not right. The other thing that we can think of is a non-universalizable action that's perfectly okay. So maybe you can pause for a second and even think. If you can think of a case where making yourself an exception to the rules is what you're doing, but there's nothing wrong with it. So here's the thought. It might, in some cases, not be necessary to act on universalizable maxims in order to be morally okay. And here's an example, and this is one that comes out of my life every now and again. You may, at some point in adulthood, learn that it's very convenient to go shopping for groceries at weird hours. It's actually much more convenient and helpful to solve that task by, going for groceries at 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night. You'll find yourself moving through the aisles of Harris Teeter very quickly and efficiently, and when you get to the checkout, there will probably be nobody else there. And we might also think, that's not immoral, that's just a smart strategy for getting your groceries conveniently. Let's run the test of universalizability on this. So we might ask first, what's my plan and what's my aim? Right? So my plan is, I will go to the grocery store after 7:30. And why am I doing this? Well, I have an aim to avoid the crowd, right? I don't want to deal with the 5 o'clock rush at the grocery store. And then I imagine, well, but what if everybody thought like me? What if everybody said, I'm going to go to Harris Teeter, not right after work, but, after dinner and dishes are over. And now everybody's got a plan to go to the store at 7:30 p.m. Well, we then ask, can my aim be achieved when everybody adopts it? Actually, no, right? If everybody adopts my plan, then my plan of avoiding the crowd is now thwarted, right? So in this sense, it would seem like I'm making myself an exception to the rules, or I'm acting on a non-universalizable maxim. But if you believe, along with me, that there's nothing wrong with avoiding a crowd, even if it is, in a certain way, making myself an exception to the rules, then this might raise some deeper philosophical questions about the importance of universalizability, consistency, and having rules that can be adopted by all. So the thought here is this is a challenge for the Kantian theory. Now, the other thing we might keep thinking about is maybe we could find a more precise way of applying the principle of universalizability that shows that it's wrong to lie, it's wrong to cut in line, and it's wrong to use the emergency lane just to get out of a traffic jam. But there's some way in which it is universalizable to go to the grocery store when it's not busy. But another way that we might do that is take another perspective on Kant's categorical imperative. So we can ask this question: is there a way to distinguish cutting in line or fanaticism from shopping for groceries when the store isn't busy? And one suggestion we might pursue is the second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. So Kant says this idea that there are moral duties that we have to follow no matter what. Well, he's going to say we can spell that out in a number of different ways, and we're going to look at that next time. So thanks for listening in, and we'll pick it up with the second formulation of the categorical imperative in the third video of this 3-part series. Thanks, y'all.